Welcome back. You're live with us tonight on In Focus. A report by Transunion released in April found that 39% of consumers plan to pay partial amounts towards their bills to remain current, and about 46% reported being past due on a bill or loan in the previous 3 months. This correlates with the National Debt Counsellors Association report, reporting a significant growth in debt counselling inquiries in 2021. Here to talk to us about the rising cost of living and how South Africans are coping, I'm joined by the Statistician-General of South Africa, Risenga, Maluleke, and Annaline Van der Pol from Debt Rescue South Africa. Good evening to you both, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Statistician-General, let's begin with yourself. How has the pandemic and the rising cost of living affected our finances? I mean, despite seeing some 1.2% growth in the GDP, has that really translated into our pockets?
Let us say that our economy, as of today when we release the GDP, is about 4 years backwards in terms of real GDP. So the size of our economy was about 1.13 trillion as of the fourth quarter of 2017. And this is where our economy is on the figures we released today of the second quarter of 2021. I must admit we had actually dropped to 947 billion in the second quarter of 2020, but we are recovering, albeit slowly. That's why we are sitting at the level where we were in 2017. Yeah. Having said that, our population has grown. It has grown by about 3.1 million people between the 4 years, between 2017 and 2021. So in terms of per capita GDP, we are seeing that there is a shrink in terms of what the numbers are saying. That is on the one side. On the other side, then let us look at unemployment. Unemployment continues to steadily rise, and the number of the unemployed people who are actively looking for employment is sitting at 7.8 million people. But when we add the discouraged work seekers, plus those who would have taken up employment and they didn't look for employment for other reasons other than discouragement, we are sitting at 11.9 million. Now, when you look at that, if the economy was translating directly into benefiting, people would be getting employed, and at this stage, we are not seeing that happening.
Yeah. And Aline, I mean, the Statistician-General painting a picture there that it is getting harder to get by each and every year. Are we being pushed closer and closer towards the poverty line and more South Africans getting to that point?
Absolutely. We're definitely seeing that. I mean, the reality is most consumers are still trying to recover from the effects of the various levels of lockdown that we've gone through in the past 20 plus months. So, from a month-to-month basis, we've seen the cost of living increasing. We've seen, the fuel price that's gone up exponentially, even though there was a slight reduction. Generally, it's significantly higher. We've had, the electricity hikes, etc. Consumers are struggling, and they really, really are at their wits' end. I mean, you have cases of former dual income households where only one person is now employed, people who became retrenched or are now working short time. They might have obtained new employment, but they're earning lower incomes. It's been devastating out there.
Statistician-General, earlier you were saying we are not back to pre-pandemic levels as far as the sum that we are bringing into the GDP. However, from where we were, I suppose, when the lockdowns started, it is certainly looking a little bit better, or looking something like a recovery. Is there a correlation between that recovery in certain businesses and certain sectors and a recovery in households? In other words, are those people who could have lost their employment in March last year back at work now, recovering at some degree?
Well, for starters, we are seeing people who are expected to work sitting at about 87%, and I'm talking as of the second quarter of 2021, whereas 13% are not expected to work. They remain in the employer's books, and I'm talking about people who are employed, yet they are not expected to work. And of those, about almost 90% are earning full salary. The rest are not earning full salary. And when you look at the inflation, while inflation does show that in June, July, for example, we are sitting at 4.6%, there are specific areas particularly where you're looking at meat, oil and fat, where people want to eat meat, where you see a rise by about 9.4%. But let me leave that for now. I'll leave that for Annaline. There's a point I want to raise here. As of 2011, poverty started rising. So coming out of about 36.3%, 36.4% to be exact, rising up to 40%. And when I'm saying poverty, 40% as of 2015, when I'm saying poverty, I'm talking about the lower bound poverty line that we are tracking in the National Development Plan. And when you look at that, in terms of current prices, that is about 840 rands per person per month. So any person who doesn't earn 840 per month in a household, and if you have a household that includes, has multiple members, each of them has to be earning at about, 840. It means they are falling below the poverty line. And with what we are seeing in inflation, certainly with the poverty line having been rising from 2011 and the impact of COVID-19, there is indeed an effect on human life.
Yeah. 2011 to 2021, has there been any respite in the middle, or has it just been a one-way down the poverty line? I mean, is there instances where citizens have seen some respite?
The poverty line, the only data we have is up to 2015. That is the last time we conducted the income and expenditure survey and the living conditions survey, owing to challenges of funding. However, the poverty line, because we factor in inflation, we are able to track it, so we know in terms of the current prices as of 2020. The 2021 numbers will come out on Thursday, that a person needs to be earning about 840 rands per month in a household per person per month. Now, in terms of the number of those who are poor, 40% of the population of the country was poor as of 2015, and beyond that, we cannot be able to say anything in terms of that.
Yeah. And let's look at that question around the basic foods, right? Increasing by 7% in the last 6 months. What has been the impact in as far as choosing to buy food and paying for electricity?
Well, you know, what we've seen, and we actually did a survey about this not too long ago, where we asked consumers, what is their the impact of COVID on their buying habits specifically. And we've seen some very interesting stats come out of there as well. But it's pointing at exactly what, Statistician-General is saying, is consumers are having to make dramatic changes in terms of how they purchase. So where historically they would go into a shop and they'd buy the items accordingly, they're now looking towards bargain shopping and bundle shopping to try and find ways of making their rand stretch further, and also making their meal stretch further, because a lot of them responded and said they'd had to get creative in how to make a meal stretch. So the reality is they really are seeing the impact on their monthly budgets, and they are making cuts. They are reviewing their expenses and bringing down what they possibly can. But for so many people, they already have done that ages ago and have no further where they can actually cut, and it's becoming an incredibly dire situation out there.
And affordability of paying their debt. I mean, one of the outcomes are saying people are paying for basic living expenses now instead of paying off debt.
Absolutely. You're seeing a multitude of different behaviors. So some of them are, not honoring the debt to make sure that they can actually still put food on the table, or they are having to take out debt to put the food on the table. In essence, buying food on credit. And taking out payday loans, so the paycheck is not lasting until the end of the month. So they're having to take out a loan, which can see them through to the end of the month so that they can, honor their debt, put food on the table, etc. And before, when payday hits, they've got to pay that back. And then not long after that, they're having to incur this again. So it's a very tough situation out there in terms of how are they going to make the income that they have stretch as far as it possibly can go.
But in conversation tonight with the Statistician-General of South Africa, Risenga Maluleke and Annaline Van der Pol from Debt Rescue South Africa, the impact of the pandemic and the rising cost of living on our finances when we continue next. We're back with you tonight on In Focus, joined by the Statistician-General of South Africa, Risenga Maluleke and Annaline Van der Pol from Debt Rescue South Africa. Statistician-General, it might sound like an anecdote from an old lady to say we used to pay 200 rands to fill up a whole tank of a car. Today we've seen double-digit fuel increases, or inflation shall one say. How has that progressed at least in the last 5 years?
Well, one of the things that we have been seeing, and even before you look at numbers, is that fuel has been increasing. The price of fuel has been increasing over the last 5 years. That is the first part. The second issue, and I want to bring it to what we have seen today when we release the second quarter GDP figures, is that we have seen the transport sector behaving a lot more stronger, or coming in a lot more stronger, with a growth of 6.9% and contributing strongly on the number 1.2%. at about 0.5 percentage point. And having said that, on the household expenditure side, we have seen households spending more on transport than they had previously done so. So while fuel is indeed increasing, households are still spending, and people have to go to work. People have to go to visit family. Obviously, what it doesn't tell is whether, from our side of data, is whether people are loaning or are making loans to make ends meet. That is the one part. The other issue that we're picking up is that the poor spend more money, or about 33% of the resources they have, on food than they do, about 33.9 on food than they would readily spend on durable goods like a house, or semi-durable goods like clothes. Actually, with durability, they spend more on non-durables, and that is not sustainable.
Yeah. Two questions. One would be on the point that you raised, that transport did well and you're seeing a rise. Are you able to tell us whether that is private transport or it's public transport? In other words, are households dependent more on buses and taxis for transport, or are they more likely to be using their own car? And will it be able to also tell you if they're feeling the strain in the rise in transport more on the public side or in their private side?
Well, not from the GDP, but let me start with the GDPs, because when we look at expenditure, we look at what they are spending generally, and the transport expenditure is much more broad. Because if you look at, for example, mining, which showed a recovery, it also does come to say that you also include such transport on the side of business. So this growth on the transport side can be bigger from the side of the production side as well. But when you come specifically from another survey that we conducted, sponsored by the Department of Transport, and I'm talking at household level, people are using more buses and taxis to get to work or to move about than they use their own private vehicles or use trains. So that space of using public transport is where they are deploying most of their resources.
With our wallets feeling much lighter, Statistician-General, this continued rise in fuel, is it sustainable, or should government be looking and thinking about readjusting their capping of the fuel price a little bit lower in the downward direction?
Well, that's a policy position. If the Statistician-General starts dabbling into that space, I will limit my independence. So I have to advise, I have to make numbers equally and freely, independently to members of the public and to government. So I'll leave that policy space to government.
Yeah, but I mean, when you look at those numbers, are they sustainable with the type of incomes that people are continuing to get, or maybe even the reductions in income that people are experiencing?
Certainly not sustainable. And I'll give you another perspective to it. Let us look at the structure of household income in South Africa. About 57% of household income comes from salaries all over the country. Only in Gauteng and the Western Cape, where it's a lot more higher, up to about 72% in the Western Cape, where it comes from salaries. But in rural provinces, for example, in the Eastern Cape, only 39% comes from salaries. When you put remittances, which is the money that we send to our relatives and our families, as well as grants, they account for more than 50%. So the rural provinces, poorer provinces, rely more on remittances and grants from government. So that is not sustainable. That is number one, because if people who are sending remittances are actually losing employment, then it's not sustainable. That is on the one side. Whereas what we have seen with the rise in terms of the number that of people who are receiving grants at household level and at the person's level, there has been an increase coming out of 2002. When that increase is going up, the vulnerability to hunger for people at household level as well as at person's level is declining. So there is a mitigation in the interim, but it's not sustainable in the long run.
Yeah. One of the things, Annaline, that has become quite expensive is health care. Do households in South Africa still have the luxury to prioritize their spend on healthcare expenses?
Well, that was also part of one of our surveys that we've done. And obviously, as we know, the statistics on private healthcare are very low. It's not a very high percentage of expenditure for the general household. But what we've definitely seen as well is people have moved plans. A lot of people have moved their plans to cheaper options and taking lesser cover, but so that they at least still have some form of cover, or alternatively have had to completely move away from it. Obviously, it depends on the type of cover that they've had, if it was employer-based and so forth, but specifically on the ones where they had the option, they went for the cheaper options, definitely.
Yeah. And debt relief programs, I mean, is that the perfect solution?
Well, look, there's a multitude of factors. Obviously, it's what we specialize in is to assist consumers who are over indebted and are struggling financially and cannot afford to repay the debt that they have at the sustainable level that is required by their original credit agreements. And it's definitely a brilliant solution that was brought in, by our government when they passed the National Credit Act to make sure that there is provision for the future for consumers that become, face a situation where they can no longer honor their debt. And what's really amazing about this is we're one of very few countries in the world where we look at your debt holistically. So we look at everything, your home loan, your vehicle finance, your unsecured debt, your personal loans and store cards, etc., and finding a holistic solution for you where you can repay all your debt whilst still making sure that your necessary living expenses are covered, making sure that the food is on the table, etc. So it's definitely, it's important that consumers are aware of their options.
Yeah. When we look at all these numbers, Statistician-General, I mean, the inflation numbers on fuel, on food, on health care, on vehicles and so on and so forth, what do they contribute to when you look at the future of South Africa? Because these are not just numbers. I don't think your job is just to merely do research on the numbers and just give them to government. I'm sure part of it is to forecast what the impact will be on a nation in the future and going forward.
Well, for starters, is that there is a national development plan, which is a guiding document that drives issues of policy and policy intervention by government, and indeed it has rallied the private sector to come on board. But I must admit that, for example, when we came and we had said as a nation that in the year 2020 we would like unemployment to be sitting at 14%. Our unemployment by end of 2020 was sitting in the region of about 30%. As of now, in the second quarter of 2021, is sitting at 34.4%. Now, that's a far cry from that 14% that we wanted to have achieved. That is number one. Number two is that as we see a rise in poverty, and we still see a rise in unemployment on the other hand, because only when people are able to get jobs will they be able to go out of poverty, because they will earn something to be able to go out of poverty. Now, when the number of jobs that we had before COVID-19, we had about 16.4 million jobs. As of now, we only have about 14.9 million people. Between the first quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, we had lost 1.4 million jobs, whereas unemployment is rising. So these numbers are showing that we have a bit of challenges ahead of us.
Yeah, significant areas that we need to pay attention to in terms of improving the situation. Does this already tell us where we need to focus?
Well, I can't say that, and I'll tell you why I can't say that as Statistician-General. I'm responsible for measuring outcomes. The area of impact and policy formulation in terms of focus areas remains with policymakers. So I would like to respect that space.
Right. I mean, ideally, when you give the numbers, the expectation is that policy formulation and implementation would certainly respond to those numbers. Well, let's wait and see if indeed they will keep up with what these numbers are reflecting. But overall, Annaline, the sense that you are getting from these numbers, the cost of living for many South Africans, is it something that they can still bear coming out of this pandemic, or what is it that they would need to do? I mean, you were talking of double salaries where both partners in the household are working, or are we looking at a future where even a single person would need to be doing at least one or two jobs?
Well, we're definitely already seeing that. Again, we did some research and we asked people, what have they changed in the past 18 plus months to see if they're not making ends meet. And there's been a significant number of people who've taken up sideline incomes, in a whole variety of things to make sure that they can try and supplement the budget, the monthly budget, making sure that they've got this additional income. So there's definitely a lot of attempts by people to try things and definitely try and fix their budget. But realistically speaking, for the bulk of people, this is still not enough. I mean, consumers have made dramatic changes to their budgets. They have reduced their expenses, cut them to the bone, etc. And then, of course, in the long run, that's also not ideal because, I mean, an economy needs people who spend. But people can't spend right now because they can barely afford to service the debt that they already have and keep, the food on the table. So right where we're sitting at this very moment, we are still seeing the long-term effect, the medium-term effect, and I think the long-term effect is still coming, of the impact that the pandemic has had on consumer finances. I don't think that this is something that's going to end in the near future. With the fact that our unemployment rate is as high as it is currently, it's painting a very difficult picture for consumers as a whole.
Whoa, sobering information there, indeed, something to think about this evening. I appreciate you both, and thank you very much for enlightening us with this information. The Statistician-General of South Africa, Risenga, Maluleke, and Annaline Van der Pol from Debt Rescue South Africa.